broadcast of a physical object, it's the inverse, it's the negative space around the entity. And so it's a kind of, it's like an inverted black and white photograph, right? It's sort of like those, like, 19th century, early 20th century, like spirit photos, right? Where like the camera came along, and, oh, let's take pictures of ghosts. So this is your,
or kind of like the negative maybe as well.
yeah, exactly. It's the negative. It's the negative. It's what shows up on the photographic plate when you take a picture of a ghost. It's the negative. And so that's what an entity is. But because the entity itself doesn't change, so the Zentity. So an entity will change, but a Zentity is just a snapshot of an entity at a moment in time. So if the entity goes on to change and change and change, you buy and sell a whole bunch of, base 64 things in your wallet, your entity will mutate, but your Zentity will always be fixed. And you can make as many Zentities as you want if you own an entity. There's a small fee associated with that, like less than 0.1 ETH, less than 0.01 ETH. But so for a small fee in the gas money, you can basically mine Zentities. And each time you mine a Zentity, you transform your entity, and I'll come back to that in a second, and you create a Zentity. And so entities are scarce and Zentities are potentially infinite.
Okay. Let me try to make sure that we unpack this, because there's a fair bit in there. So first of all, first of all, your entity is changing all the time. And then this Zentity function for a small fee allows you to create like a cast, right? And we can get into, I'm sure you'll take us through like why bother doing that, right? But once you create the cast, there's also an operation that you'll take. So the creation of the cast itself modifies your entity according to some logic that you'll walk us through. But before we get to that logic, what does a Zentity look like? Because it doesn't look like just numbers. If your entity is like a series of numbers, it's not just the inverse of those numbers that your entity then looks like, correct?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So the entity, you see the actual numbers rendered in the artwork itself. But for the Zentity, you get something else. And so the group I mentioned earlier, CCRU, who developed this kind of cybergoth philosophy in the 90s for the coming like Y2K digital generation, when they were kind of coming up with these hyperstitional characters like Auguste Barrow and Auguste's alphanumeric gematria, they were also developing through other hyperstitional characters, in this case, somebody named D.C. Barker, other mathematical occult notational systems and systems for kind of doing what they called time sorcery. And you can actually read the whole logs on the internet. All of their kind of BBS, early BBS kind of messages and stuff were all kind of recorded in a blog by a philosopher named Reza Negarestani. And one of those characters, DC Barker, was somebody who in the 80s was working at NASA, and they were challenged with the question of if our big satellites got a bunch of like structured information coming from outer space, how would we know it's not just a quasar star, dying and emitting a whole bunch of frequencies, and rather than say like an alien civilization beaming, some kind of broadcast to the universe saying we are here.
And to be clear, DC Barker is what you would call a hyperstition, right?
Well, it's a hard
or
one.
not clear.
Well, the whole point of a hyperstition is it's not clear. So yes and yes.
Okay. Okay.
I couldn't find any evidence that they ever lived in the flesh.
But the system works, and I think it reminds me of it. I wouldn't be surprised if it informed movies like Contact, right? Yeah. Where they describe this system where there are prime numbers involved, and that's how you know that it's not just noise, right? But it's also universal enough that you don't need for an alien civilization to have like, an alphanumeric or some, some representation of the math underneath that depends on our own, sort of development of language that might be completely different for for another intelligent being.
That's right. Like, you mentioned the primes. The thing about primes, I'm speaking off the cuff, so I could be wrong, but I think the thing about primes is it doesn't matter what base system you're using. So if you're using a base 2 system or a base 10 system, your primes are basically just, you could be counting apples. It doesn't matter how many numbers you have in your odometer until it rolls over to the to the next
Right.
case. You just have either 4 or 7 or 11 apples, and 4 can be split up into 2 and 2, but 7 cannot be split up into anything that you multiply together to get 7, and same for 11. So primes are like, they're a fundamental aspect of the concept of numeracy that doesn't matter on your cultural interpretation of it.
Got it.
And so this system basically, it's called the high prime notation, or tick Z notation. And we got very excited because Z notation seems like exactly the right notation for his entity, in a kind of synchronistic or synchromystical kind of way. And basically the way it works is you basically encode each number according to its space, or its position of prime numbers. And so we shared this with the artist, and also the idea that you didn't just have to use these open and closed parentheses and dots. You could use many different, delimiters and denoters and so on to basically encode a matrix, this entity matrix, into this notation. And so they came back with this one, which is kind of hard to see with the contrast on this screen. But basically, it's a series of kind of ticks and asterisks, and then words that kind of look like yes and no, to delimit between rows and columns. And then also there's some sort of Easter eggs in there for whenever you arrive at something like a 0 or some kind of singularity. But so anyways, you get this, and the artist said, when they were like designing this through us, they said it looked like, I'm going to butcher this, but something like the lost manuscript of Beckett's Not I. I think that's, not even knowing what that is, that just feels exactly right to me.
Right. And so one question I have about this is why treat the entity this way and not the entity? So why display numbers for the entity, but this binomic high prime Z notation for this entity?
I think there's like a basic answer, which is that by introducing aesthetic variety into the project, it allows other people to interpret it more in their own way. And actually, I should re-say that, because it's actually the opposite, but I need to reframe that. So the point of this project is it has an aesthetics. The images I've been showing on the screen are actually early sketches. So when we launch it, people will be able to see that the entities and identities look a little bit different than this. It has its own aesthetics. It has a kind of very occult black and red kind of aesthetic, with certain types of fonts and kerning and letter spacing and symmetries and all that kind of stuff. But it's still fairly neutral, almost Lute-like in its neutrality. Which I think is another thing that allowed Lute to be so generative, is that when the aesthetic is neutral enough, other people feel confident building on top of it because it's a canvas rather than something that's already in a frame. And so we wanted it to be kind of like a canvas, but we also wanted it to be somewhat legible where necessary. So with I say we, but this is my interpretation. The artist would have to give you their answer. The entity is a bunch of numbers, and those numbers are constantly mutating. And because they're constantly mutating, there's something about the cognizance of that, the ability to make it intelligible, that when you see it, when you interact with it, when you cast it, manifest it, when you sell and buy things and put them in your wallet and it changes, you get the immediate sense that like, hey, I'm getting a slice of this thing. So it's already occulted. You're already only seeing part of it, but the part you're seeing is legible. With this entity, it never changes. It's frozen. Once you, the function to make it is called cast, like casting a sculpture, casting a spell. When you cast this entity off of an entity, it's frozen in time. It's a photograph. It's a negative, right? So it could just be the numbers in that matrix, But by abstracting it away into something that is, can be decoded, so you can actually get the numbers out of this if you run the decoder.
Yep.
But by abstracting it away, it allows other people to build on top of it without necessarily creating something that itself is also numerological. So we've actually been in conversation with a few artists, K21 artists and others.
Yep.
Some of, if I could say out loud who these artists were, my goodness. Other artists that are really excited to be able to like ingest a Zentity and treat it almost like a moment in time that their NFTs can then build on top of. And so as somebody accrues more Zentities in their wallet, that Zentity will, that number of Zentities will transform and change these forthcoming NFT art projects. You can actually create, generative art that stays alive and keeps generating.
Yes.
On top of these entities. And by putting them in this coded language, we're introducing a kind of aesthetic of building on top of a cipher, and a cipher that can be interpreted any way you want. You can decode this TXT notation into numbers, but you could also encode it further. You could say, okay, my interpretation is all of the Ys correspond to a red pixel and an S is a yellow pixel, right? So it just gives that other variety.
And so that variety, like, I completely see that. And I guess even from a practical perspective, if you inspect your wallet and you see like all these matrices that look identical, except that, try to spot the one that's the entity, right? Because it'll change, but they look otherwise identical. So even from a practical perspective, there's usefulness in there being something that's clearly very different, but also, on top of that, the fact that, it's not going to change. So then it's actually practical to have it, in that form.
Right.
And what's interesting there, and you sort of touched on it, and I just want to make sure that the viewers realize, because this Zentity is also a base 64 NFT. Once you create the Zentity, that is going to, and so you mint it, so it's going to end up in your wallet. That is then going to feed back into your entity, which will change your entity. And moreover, if, as you described, right, other projects like maybe some K21 or other artists build using this and build using the same setup where they're creating base 64 NFTs, when you create a Zentity, not only will the Zentity itself then feed back into the entity, but it will then also cascade into all the other NFTs that have built on this, and they themselves will change, which will then change your entity as well. I mean, do I have that right?
This is why this is a 2-hour phone call or conversation, and we're
it's probably one of those like 4-hour, Joe Rogan type episodes.
Yeah, for crypto nerds, right? So and math nerds and magic nerds,
right,
and art nerds. So like as soon as it's very basic, right? We've distilled this, and this is why it felt sort of like we've tapped into something. There's only a few functions. There's the pass function, there's the token URI function that we call manifest, there's the mint function we call animo, and then there's a bind function, which we'll get to shortly. And and there's an add dimension function. And so, yes, if somebody or us were to add the Zentity contract as a dimension in the Daemonica universe, and every time somebody casts a Zentity, it's going to immediately end up in their wallet. So, and if it's registered and recognized as a dimension, then it's going to transform the entity that's in their wallet as well. And likewise, if someone were to build, like we're going to with other artists, build on top of, say, Zentities, and use this bind function that we'll get to in a minute, then the Zentities, when you mint them, will transform those entities in those other NFTs in their wallet. And if those NFTs were also added as dimensions, then that'll also feed back on the original entity. So it ends up creating this system where just by a few functions and a few thousand, entities, you create a kind of ever proliferating register of time. If every time the entity changes form and shape, it's moving ahead kind of like one moment in time. And that time also has a spatiality or a structure or a shape to it, where there's the frequency time, which is each of, the numbers in the matrix. Those are frequencies. There's when you buy and sell NFTs in your wallet that are registered dimensions, you change the entity, so time changes again. That's a kind of like three or n dimensional time. You have a spatial time, you have a frequency time, and then the last one is what happens when you call cast and you create a entity. Because not only do you, create a snapshot, a negative snapshot of your entity, the entity itself is transformed in the process. So should I talk?
Yes. So I do want to get to this, to the transformation that happens in addition to the when you're creating this entity. Just very quickly, you don't, like, if you're a project building on Daemonica, you're not restricted to building on top of the entities, which are the snapshots. You could also build on top of the actual entity itself, right?
Yes, exactly. So you have two choices. You can build on top of entities in whichever way you want, and those are frozen in time. They're fixed images, or you can build on top of an entity or multiple entities. I mean, you could. Okay, so this is cutting to the chase a little bit, right?
Yeah.
As we said before, the coefficients of a matrix can be used to describe a Fourier transform, which itself is how you make an image filter, for example.
Yep.
So, you could interpret every entity as a filter, and you could apply that filter to your own artwork. Yeah. And as that entity changes, your artwork would morph and change.
And if it's a dimension, then that morph and change is then going to morph and change into the entity itself. If it's built, using the entity, right, as opposed to this entity.
Exactly. You get that positive feedback, and I don't even know how that's going to play out. We'll have to see.
Well, that I'd be very interested. I can't wait for someone to try that out, because that would be, just a complete, mind blowing. So
what it would mean, actually, I do know what it would mean is that every time somebody calls token URI, which means refreshes the OpenSea page, right? For example, hard refreshes it. It's going to update your entity just based on what's already, or your NFT, your artwork, just based on what's already in your wallet. Nothing else has to change. It's just somebody called render. So there's this kind of famous aphorism. I can't remember. I think multiple cultures lay claim to this. It's the idea that you can never walk across the same river twice. Right. And then, the pupil says to the master, in fact, master, you can never step into the same river once, or walk across the same river once. Same kind of thing. If you and I both say, okay, refresh, and you're living in Miami and I'm living in Antarctica, and we both do it at the exact same time, whoever gets to the server first is going to render this new NFT artwork. And then I get there second, say, I'm going to get a different artwork just because you rendered it before me. Yeah. So you literally create an artwork that nobody can see the same thing as anybody else.
Wow.
At the same time. It can only.
But it's the same NFT, and there's no gas involved, because that's just literally asking, like, show me. It's kind of like the magic mirror in Beauty and the Beast, right? Just show me what do you got, and and what it shows you might be completely different to what I see if I do the same. Do the same thing.
And nothing else happened. Nobody bought or sold an NFT. The entity didn't change, nothing. But because we created a positive feedback loop with that future NFT project into the Daemonica universe, it will, by calling render token URI, it'll update the entity, and then it'll update that NFT as well.
So it's a little bit like, I find, like, when I hear that, I find it like a little bit stress inducing, because I just want to pin this thing down. Like, can I see it? And so I guess that is part of the function of a entity, or maybe part of the motivation, right, for creating a entity. Would be good. Look, I want to capture it right now. What's that? Sorry?
Very imperial impulse.
Well, I am proud of my Western heritage. There are two sides of that story.
think about it, right? This is the rabbit hole we're going down. Explorers going to the Amazon in the 19th century and encountering butterflies they'd never seen before. They pull out the net, they capture them, and they literally pin them to a pincushion. They bring
I did that as a kid. It's quite awful now to think about
something beautiful, and you've frozen it because you don't want it to change. It's that thing, that moment in time. It's a piece of art. It's a crystallized piece of art that you can taxonomize, you can put in a drawer, you can collect it.
You can show someone.
You can show somebody. You can look at it and marvel it, but it's frozen now in time. What we're saying with this is you can never pin it down in the scenario we're discussing. we've literally made it such that artists can create artworks that are themselves alive.
Yeah.
And you know, if this were a centralized server, this is why the blockchain is magic. If this were a centralized server and two people, you're in Miami and I'm in Antarctica, we both call render. We say, hey, Amazon Web Service, send me the image of, I don't know, whatever. And it's an artwork, right? It's an NFT on-chain artwork or whatever, but it's being rendered from a server. And let's say that thing is supposed to update with the weather and where you are, right? I'm in something like that.
Yeah.
Well, what if you and I do it at the exact same time? With a centralized server, it's going to have parallel daemons. It's going to have parallel processing. So it's going to process yours and mine at the same time. And if the conditions are the same, if we're both in Miami and it's sunny that day and it's 2:32 p.m. in 10 seconds, we're both going to get the same image because it's being rendered from that data. And if you did it 10 seconds after me, you might get a different image. But if we do it at the same time, we have a race condition, we get the same thing. On the blockchain, that's impossible because the blockchain is deterministic. So it doesn't run these things in threads. If they're dependent on each other, it runs them necessarily in series. So it'll say either FastTackle or OX Animus got here first. We're going to render FastTackles. FastTackle got here first. And then we're going to render OX Animus. But because FastTackle is rendering updated the image, OX Animus gets a different image. So nobody can see the same thing twice. You can right-click Save As and say, hey, I stole your artwork. But as soon as somebody downloads the real or looks at the real thing later, it's going to be different.
It's going to be different. That is just mind-blowing. So Zentities, when you create a Zentity, you don't just create that cast, which again is maybe like the more illuminated way of capturing something than like pinning it down, because it's more like taking a photograph, right, where you're not harming the thing underneath. Okay, so then that cast or that image is taken, that imprint is taken. What happens to the other than the movement because of the creation of this new NFT, which might feed back into it, other than that, what happens to the underlying entity when you create this imprint?
Yeah. Okay, cool. So again, this wasn't like so much intentional. It was sort of there was kind of like there was resonances with the work of CCRU in the 90s that kind of drew us to kind of revisit it. And then we started to realize that like they actually laid out a pretty interesting playbook that as we were encoding things according to the artist's wishes and you know, by the answers that the artist would send to our questions and so on, we almost backed into creating a system that plays out according to the numogram. The numogram is the image on my screen. This is a specifically decimal or base 10 numogram. And this was something that the CCRU group created that's basically a kind of numerical tree of life. So if you've ever looked at Kabbalah, there's this concept of a tree of life, which is a kind of, there's 10 spheres or sephiroth or little circles that are kind of all connected in a kind of strange web. And each one of them represents a different concept, a stage in life, a kind of esoteric, occult kind of mode of being and so on. And, you know, the adept, the initiate walks the tree of life. So they go through different aspects and they kind of embody different modes of consciousness and insight. In this case, the tree of life is this one, which is the numogram, can be interpreted the same way. It can also be seen as, you know, and this is a very animist thing about CCRU and their interpretation, was that these numbers themselves were alive. So remember, definition of animism, you extend personhood beyond humans. So that doesn't just mean jaguars in the jungle can be persons. It means numbers can be persons. And when numbers can be
corporations can be persons.
Well, corporations are persons, apparently.
No, I'm joking.
Right. So yeah, exactly. The US government is just a bunch of pseudo-animists or ersatz animists in the end.
Right.
So if numbers can be persons, then they can have agency, they can be alive, and you can bump into them and meet them. And so a big part of time sorcery, there's a person that goes by the name, the handle Vexus, who's been doing this really interesting exploration the last 2 years of diving into the CCRU archives and doing this kind of time sorcery and meeting the number 7, the number 2, the number 5, and the different entities or demons, daemons, whatever, that sort of like are what one conjures when one contemplates and engages zone 7, zone 2, zone 5. And it's not just that, you know, each of these things along this tree of life are themselves embodied in entities. And just a quick aside, like in ancient Egypt, concepts were gods, gods were concepts, right? So like Ma'at was magic and magic was Ma'at, and Ma'at was also, they were multi-dimensional. So like these entities, these beings that had their own agency, that were their own persons, that people venerated, made sculptures to, statues, talismans, and so on. One could meet in an altered state of consciousness, and they would at once be an entity, a person, and a concept. And so the numogram, think of it kind of that way. As you traverse the numogram, you're traversing an entity, a person, a concept, a number, of all of the above.
I find very striking parallels between this particular numogram for some reason and say the silver fern or like the hooks of Polynesian culture. But maybe that's just to my eye.
No, I think this is the part of this is this is why I think magic's real, not just because of my experiences with it, but because when you start to look at other cultures, not as a colonialist looking to appropriate, you know, like people looking for plants in the Amazon to make their teeth whiter or something like that.
Right.
But when you start looking at it almost like what anthropologists should be, which is just curious about the human condition and its history, you start to see like these things that just repeat and these things that rhyme. And, you know, there's that kind of famous aphorism of like the wise men and the elephant, and one, you know, or the blind men and the elephant, and each of them has a different piece of the elephant, and one has the ear and says, oh, it's a leaf, and another has the trunk and says, oh, it's a rope. Another one has a leg and says, oh, it's a tree. And they're all right. It's all part of an elephant, but the elephant is kaleidoscopic. It's a hologram. It's multidimensional. And so each of them is able to turn that leaf into something, or that trunk, or that rope into something, if they're sufficiently capable. And humans have been doing that for literally hundreds of thousands of years. And in doing so, literally through trial and error, have discovered some really interesting aspects of that elephant that is reality. And different cultures have different pieces of it. And of course, they rhyme with each other because it couldn't be any other way. And if it was any other way, it would mean that we're just making it up.
Right. And so how do I traverse, you know, just through arithmetic, through this numogram, and what are the areas of interest?
So if we just focus on the big numbers, the base 10 means the numbers from 0 to 9, and then you go to the next digit, right?
Okay.
So if you take the base 10 numbers, 0 to 9, and you organize each number into pairs, where the pairs add up to 9. So 9 and 0 are a pair because 9 plus 0 is 9, 1 and 8 equals 9, and so on, right?
Okay.
So that's the first thing. That's how you cluster them. Then you look at them and say, okay, subtract the lower one from the bigger one, and then see what that gives you, and make an arrow that points to that next number. So 2 is less than 7. So you go 7 minus 2 gives you 5. And that's why there's an arrow pointing to 5. 5 is bigger than 4. So 5 minus 4 is 1. And that points to 1. 8 minus 1 is equal to 7. And now you've created a circuit. So latent, we didn't make that up. We just followed a logic, a law, and it gave us a triangle. It gave us this circuit of 1, 8, 2, 7, 5, 4. 3 and 6. 6 minus 3 is 3. So that points back to itself. That's a circuit. It's a 2-digit circuit. And then 9 and 0, same thing. So you have these 3 sections in the base 10 numogram. And just like the Sephiroth on the Tree of Life, there's different ways of progressing or traversing from one Sephiroth, one sphere, one set of concepts, one set of consciousnesses to another. In this case, you have to basically contemplate, you know, what is the difference between 2 and 7? You have to become familiar, intimately familiar enough with both 2 and 7 to understand what is their difference, what is the tension between them. Creates enough of a current that it can propel you all the way over to 5. And then where did you land when you got to 5? And this is the praxis of time sorcery, is kind of like diving into numbers and trying to evoke meaning from communion with them. And this is the topology. So if you just, but if you change it, if you did a base 14 numogram, the shape would be different.
Yeah.
And so that's what we did.
Yeah. Can I ask on that tree? Because I am struggling, is probably my limited arithmetic capability, to then see like where the 10, the 28, the 45, the 21 come from.
Oh yeah, I skipped those. Those use an operation called accumulation and plexing.
And just sorry, just 1 second.